About one in four, sorry about that, about 1 in 4 teens experience some form of teen dating violence. And about 1 in 10 teens experience a severe physical teen dating violence.
Thanks. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the prevalence that we just talked about and with respect to physical violence and psychological and sexual coercion. And before I get onto the slide, one of the things I like to talk about sexual coercion is, with adults, I think it's a little bit more clear cut of what is sexual assault and what's not. With adolescents, there's about 50% of folks that are sexually coerced by the time they graduate high school. And where's that problematic is it doesn't necessarily meet the definition of rape, but it might be as consequential. And it's have sex with me, why won't you have sex with me? All your other friends are having sex, why won't you have sex? This sort of pounding down until they get the answer they want. Or it's, if you don't have sex with me, I'm going to send those nude pictures you sent to me to all of our friends. So these threats, stuff that doesn't necessarily meet the legal definition of rape, but is quite consequential. All right, so here's a study. You don't have to, we're not going to grade you on these numbers or anything, but it's basically a study that I have been doing, my team and I have been doing since 2010. We started with 1,000 kids in the Houston areas, and we've been following that same 1,000 kids now for 13 years, and we have we have funding to continue following them. So from when they're age 15 to when they're about age 30 years old, we're going to have all kinds of annual information on these kids, looking at the risk and protective factors of dating violence. It's actually the longest longitudinal study on dating violence that's ever existed. And we've gotten some really cool findings out of this. And the reason I put this up here is I want to talk about some of them now. And who's controlling the slide deck? Is that us? No, not me. Can someone go to the next slide? There it is. So here's some rates that look a lot like what Meredith just put up on the prevalence of partner violence. She put up to about 10% of physical violence, 25% of any type of abuse. And when we look at higher risk samples or more samples that are in urban areas, urban high schools, you see a little bit higher rates. And that's sort of what we see here. And you can see here, this is from 8 years of my study. You can see year 1 is when they were freshmen, year 2 sophomore, year 3 junior, and so forth. And you can look at this, and it looks pretty similar to that, right? So about 15 to 22% of teens have been in a violent relationship, have been victimized by their partner in the past year. But then you go to the next slide, and this is what's really interesting. And I think we're going to shake the field up a little bit. We've have this paper out for review right now, and what it's saying is, if you look at this sample over time, over 8 years, that and you don't just limit it to past year, or rather you count each year whether or not the past year they experienced violence at any time in the past year of the last 8 years, half the sample have been in a physically violent relationship. So half the sample in 8 years of study, so from 15 to about 23, so at 23 years old, about half of the sample have been victims of physical violence by their partner, which is a whole lot higher than what we talk about in the field, which is already alarming. And if you go to the next slide, and then this is for people that were not. So I put up a little while ago is 21% of people at freshmen had been in a violent relationship in their lifetime. So we took those people out of the study. We removed them. And just in those 7 years, not counting those folks that have experienced violence in their lifetime, 41% of our participants have been a victim of violence. So in the next 7 years. So it's not just something that happens, once they're in high school. If they've experienced violence, and they haven't experienced violence, they're fine. This is something that continues to happen. Even new events between, for instance, year 3 at 21% and year 6 at 36%. That's a 15% increase from about age, I don't know, 18 to 21. So a lot of people are experiencing new violence at older ages. And if you go to the next slide, this is also interesting because, and you can just click three more times. If you look at these are particular. So we asked, like most studies on violence, they ask about individual items. And why I put this up is it's not just one item driving the high rate. So this is, by the time, again, year 8 is about 23. By the time they're 23 years old, 34% have been had something thrown at them by their partner. 29% have had their hair pulled or slapped. 34% have been hit or punched. And then 39% have been pushed, shoved, or shook. And then if you go to the next slide. So here is sexual victimization. So this is actual sexual assault, so not coercion. So this is rape. And you see for females, it's about 17.5% of females by the time they're 23, and 9% of males by the time they're 23. And what makes this sample really cool is because they were recruited in high school and followed post-high school, it's not just a college sample, which is a lot of what we have out there in the research. So this is more of a natural sample that some went to college, some went to the military, some went to the workforce, some played video games and hung out with their parents all day, which is what I wish I would have been able to do. If you go to the next slide, sexual victimization, similar thing that we're seeing. By 23, 11% have been forced sexual intercourse. This is boys and girls together. Next slide. So there are some people who are more at risk, and I can't remember. I think you're going to start off talking about this, right, Meredith?
Yeah, but feel free to
go for it. I'll throw in some stuff, but go
acknowledging, yeah, that there are some people that are more at risk to experience teen dating violence, and violence in an intimate relationship. Those who have a prior history of partner violence, experiencing depression and anxiety, irregular medical care, the access, right? Participating in other risky behaviors, and then exposure to community or interparental violence as well. Jeff, I'll hand it back to you.
All right, cool. So if you click on the next slide, I think it's going to highlight risky behaviors. And this is something that I've actually, you know what? I think I jumped ahead a little bit there, but this is. But since I did jump ahead, I'm going to talk about that and then come back to risky behaviors. What we do see with LGBTQ populations, thank you, and we've done some studies on this, and it's increasing the amount of what's known, is they seem to look like other kids in terms of their risk for dating violence. The couple of exceptions being, one is the type of abuse with gay teens. Often it's threats of outing the other person. That's a form of psychological abuse that we see in these relationships. The other thing that we see is that it might be with bisexual kids who identify as bisexual might be more at risk than, and not just of violence. We see this with substance use and risky sexual behavior, and it seems to be a riskier population than relative to those who identify as straight heterosexual or straight homosexual. And so the other area that I studied quite a bit is the link to risky behaviors and how dating violence is associated with risky behaviors. And we know that risky behaviors tend to cluster together. And I think y'all would agree with me, is oftentimes the same kids that are in a violent relationship are the same ones that are abusing drugs or are partaking in risky sexual behavior. And so these risky behaviors tend to cluster together. And if you go to the next slide, we see that one of the things that I've looked quite a bit at is how the relationship between alcohol and drugs and dating violence. And there's been a lot of cross-sectional research. That's where they just look at one point in time that has linked physical violence to substance use. Like, we know that kids who use alcohol are also the kids who are violent and who are victims of violence. But what we don't know is whether or not they are linked over time. They are temporally associated with each other, which is important from a predictive model or from a cause and effect model, right? So what we did was we studied this longitudinally with that study. And if you go to the next slide, what we found was that substance use as freshmen, if they were used substances, they were more likely to perpetrate dating violence over the next year, even if we controlled for the violence as freshmen. So this is above and beyond the effects of violence related to violence. This was substance use related to. Now, we don't know how it was related. It could just be that if you use substances, maybe you hang out with a riskier crowd, and they're more likely to be violent. Or people use substances and use violence. Maybe there's an underlying third variable, like experiencing child abuse or something. Or maybe it is even in the moment that if you use substances, your defenses are down, your inhibitions are down, and you're more likely to end up in a violent relationship. So this study didn't say why necessarily, but it just showed that it was predictive of it over time. But we have done, and I'm getting a little bit tangential here. We've done some research, and others have done research where they've really looked at almost the causal link between violence, our substance use and violence. And a lot of, back in when I first started in this field 25 years ago, there was a pushback to saying, let's not blame the alcohol, let's not blame the drugs, because then we're sort of condoning their violence. And I get that point. But when you start to look at the studies that when someone drinks, studies that we've done, it's like 10 times more likely to be violent. When they heavy drink, it's like 35 times to be violent versus when they don't drink. So I mean, I don't want to condone or justify the violence because of the substance use, but it's a hell of a big problem. And we've actually gone a step further, and with batterers, we've just treated their substance use, are treated alongside other forms of violence prevention. But if we can reduce their substance use, we tend to also reduce their violence. So it's maybe not a one-to-one relationship, but it's pretty strong. And I think if we could get rid of drugs and alcohol, I really like my alcohol, so I hope we don't get rid of them. But if we could get rid of drugs and alcohol, we could almost solve family violence, partner violence. Not entirely, but almost. Do you go to the next slide? And click it one more time. I can't remember what I said here. Oh yeah, exposure to community and interparental violence. So here's another thing that we know, and I mentioned this earlier. This is one of the biggest risk factors for violence victimization and perpetration is being exposed to any form of violence. And this is any form. This is corporal punishment. This is gang violence, interparental violence, peer violence, sibling violence. Any exposure to violence is associated with future violence. And so we did a study on the next slide where we know this. We know that witnessing violence between your parents is associated with your own use of dating violence perpetration. We know that. So this study isn't saying anything new in that respect. But what it is saying is we did something different than other researchers, where we looked at the importance of father to mother violence and mother to father violence. So witnessing that. And what we found, interestingly enough, it was witnessing mom to dad violence, which was the significant salient predictor of both boys and girls' future use of violence. So that's huge. And it really says that we cannot discount female to male violence. Again, going back to when I started in this field 20 years ago, and I would talk about female to male violence, I would get run out of the room because, that's not the issue. Still not the issue. But what I think we've realized as a field and as researchers is that violence begets violence. So if we ignore female to male violence, we're doing a disservice to girls and women, because we know that girls do use violence. It's not as threatening. It's not as injurious. It's not anything of that. And without blaming the victim, perpetration of violence is probably the strongest predictor of victimization. And this study shows too that it might be, witnessing mom to dad violence is more important. And what we speculated in that study is maybe it's more important because girls are the ones that, moms are the ones that kids identify with, right? They spend more time with their mom, they associate more with their mom, so they're probably more likely to mimic their mom's behavior. And it could just be that if the mom's using violence, that's just reflective of overall more violence in the home, which then you would think that would be more a better predictor of their use of violence. And the next slide. The other cool part about this study, what we found was that acceptance of dating violence fully explained the relationship between witnessing violence and their perpetration of violence. And so why that's important is, so basically, let me just say, if someone witnessed their mother to father violence, but that kid did not think violence was acceptable, they were no more likely to perpetrate violence than their friends who did not witness violence. And that's really, really important from a prevention perspective, because oftentimes we can't do anything about the witnessing of parent violence. I wish we could get rid of all violence, but we can't. And since we can't, and unfortunately, there's no matter what we do, there are going to be some kids that are going to be exposed to violence. So let's teach them that violence isn't okay, that violence isn't an acceptable way to solve problems. Give them skills to solve problems that don't involve violence. Then even if they are unfortunate enough to see their violence between their parents, they won't then perpetrate violence. Next slide. I see that there's some questions. I'm happy to take them as we go, and or wait till the end. I don't care. I'll also say that just so you guys don't think I'm being a jerk to Meredith, we worked this out earlier of who would present what, and she was cool with me presenting this stuff. So just so you know, I'm not being a ball hog and taking time away from Meredith. So another study that we did was we looked at childhood physical abuse and dating violence to see if child physical abuse, so being a victim of physical abuse, was related to future perpetration and victimization of dating violence. And this isn't a huge surprise. We know that if you're abused as a kid, you're more likely to be a victim and a perpetrator later on. Where the study was really neat is that we looked at the mental health of being physically abused. So the kids that were anxious, depressed, and developed PTSD, and how that fit into the relationship between physical abuse and later dating violence. And what we found, it was PTSD that was the prevailing factor. So the kids who developed PTSD, those were the ones that were more likely to perpetrate and be victimized by dating violence. Hugely important from a prevention perspective, because that's saying that, you know what, we oftentimes can't do anything about the child. I mean, we're going to work toward it, but oftentimes it's too late, and these kids have experienced physical abuse. But one way we can break the cycle is by preventing or treating the PTSD. If you go to the next slide. All right. So my favorite paper here is published in Pediatrics. And it was where we developed an algorithm to predict dating violence perpetration. So, it's really kind of like a decision tree, and how do you know if someone's going to perpetrate dating violence? It's not 100% certainty, of course, but it's a pretty good calculator, if you will, that if a kid is exposed to dating violence, is maltreated themselves, and doesn't know how to resolve conflicts, that is a pretty good recipe for the fact that they will likely perpetrate dating violence as adolescents, which is huge, right? Now that we know that, we can focus our limited resources on these kids who have experienced 1, 2, or especially 3 of these. We know to focus our resources on them. And then sexual dating violence, it was those with a violent dating history and had attitudes accepting of violence. If they met those 2 criteria, they were much more likely than their peers to perpetrate sexual dating violence. Again, we don't have a lot of resources. We wish that we could do everything and anything to help these kids, but we can't. So knowing what we really need to focus on is huge for the field. If you go to the next slide. All right. So now, so what do we do about it? So this is one thing that I have been doing quite a bit with is this program called 4th-R. And I assume a few people on this call have heard of it. And it's the 4th-R stands for relationships. It's reading, writing, arithmetic. The 4th-R, of course, being relationships. And 2 of those don't start with R. So don't worry about that. And what we've done with this is, what it is it replaces your typical health curriculum that's in schools, so middle school or high school, and it teaches kids how to be in a relationship, which is amazing. And at the same time, how the hell have we not done this before, right? Like we teach kids everything. We teach them how to play sports and how to play musical instruments and how to read and write and study history and do their makeup. And I mean, anything and everything we teach kids, but we don't teach them the one skill that really is important for making us healthy and happy. And it's a lifelong skill. And by the way, it makes us do all those other things better. We don't teach them that. So if I were to ask you guys, I'm trying not to say you guys, trying to be better. If I were to ask y'all, if you were taught how to be in a relationship, my guess is that none of you would raise your hand. Maybe 1 or 2 with an impressive background or something. But most of you have not been taught. I haven't been taught. I assume Meredith hasn't been taught. And so how we are taught is a few different ways. 1, by our friends who are equally as terrible as we are. 2, the media, which is absolutely sucks. 3, our parents, which may be good, right? There's some parents that are good, but even the well-intentioned parents, they might argue in front of their kids, but then they make up away from their kids. So even good parents don't necessarily do a good job of modeling how to resolve conflicts. My wife probably hates me because when my kids were younger, we'd always have to say, well, if we argue in front of our kids, we better make up in front of them. So I'm just saying I'm an annoying husband. And then the last way people learn is through trial and error. So the fact that 75%, or depending on what study, 50% of kids are not in an abusive relationship is kind of impressive when you consider the fact that we give them 0 skills on how to be in a relationship. So if you go to the next slide, one of the things that 4th-R does is the relationship skills. It teaches kids how to apologize. It teaches kids how to break up with someone, how to refuse and ask for a naked picture if you don't want to give one, how to have healthy conflicts. The fact that conflicts are healthy. Conflicts exist in every single relationship. If your relationship does not have conflict, there's something wrong with your relationship. They all have conflict. It's not about avoiding conflicts. It's about how to solve and resolve that conflict in a healthy, happy, nonviolent way. And so the other really cool thing about 4th-R that I like is going back to what I talked about earlier about how these risky behaviors cluster together. We've had a tendency in schools and in our fields to target these sort of on siloed basis, it really inefficiently. They have a red ribbon week on substance use. They have an assembly on risky sexual behavior. They have a guest speaker on violence. They have a couple days on bullying. They have all these things that don't really work. Not don't really work. They absolutely just flat out don't work. And in fact, sometimes may even make it worse. So they don't work. They're inefficient. And so what this does is it targets the shared risk and protective factors of multiple problem behaviors. So that way it's efficient. So, a semester long course, people balk at, like, oh my God, that's a semester long. You're going to take them away from class, all this stuff. But really it's collapsing everything that they should be getting throughout the 4 years into the semester. And arguably, I would say that they need this they need a healthy relationship class every single day for all 4 years of high school and all 3 years of middle school and all 6 years of elementary school and every year before and after. I mean, this is how important it is. And for even the diehard people who don't care about kids, like Republicans, I'm kidding, being recorded, I'm kidding. But even if you don't care about kids, even from a fiscal standpoint, from a financial standpoint, we're just better learners. We're better future tax-paying citizens if we're in healthier relationships. So, we're going to be able to learn how to read and write and history and math if we are healthy. And so anyway, that's sort of what this idea is, that it attacks these problematic behaviors by improving mental health, improving mental well-being, improving relationships, while preventing some of the risk factors. And if you go to the next slide, actually keep going to the next slide. We don't need to see that one. And then one more. Yeah, there it is. So what's important about this, a couple things from this slide, is it takes a positive youth development approach. So it's not just about avoiding violent relationships, but it's about how to have healthy and happy relationships. So a lot of times we're always like, don't do this, don't do this, don't do that, don't do that, with the idea of avoiding violence or avoiding bad stuff. But we don't really teach kids how to have good relationships, how to have fun and sexually positive and healthy and happy relationships. And so it does a better job at that. Another point about 4th R that I really like, and this is one that I like, by the way, I didn't create it, it's one that I like and that I studied quite a bit, is that it's universal in its focus, so that all kids in a particular school or a particular grade get 4th R. And that's important for many reasons. One is we don't, stigmatize quote unquote bad kids by pulling them out for a special class. 2, we don't put bad kids with other bad kids that just make them badder. It's a really stupid model we have in the States and many other countries. This alternative school, or DAEP, is where we put these quote unquote bad kids together. And it's just a really dumb thing to do, because it's going to have this contagious effect where it's going to make them worse. And we see it in our prison system. It's just a really dumb thing that we do. It just makes people worse. So this puts, all the kids together, and kids get to learn from each other. The other thing that's important about universal focus is, we're talking about making kids healthier and happy, not just avoiding bad stuff. So the best case scenario with this is that we prevent a lot of violence. The worst case scenario is that our kids get to be in healthier, happier relationships. That's pretty good. If you go to the next slide. So what we've done with it, we've partnered with the city of Houston in high violence areas, and we've taken a 2-pronged approach where we did 4th R in the schools, and then we did a thing called CPTED, crime prevention through environmental design, outside of schools, which means trimming bushes so people can't hide in them, taking the posters off of liquor stores and corner markets so that the police and people can see through, so it's less likely to be robbed. And then we've done 4th R in the schools there and studied that with them. Some really cool results there. We've implemented it quite a bit. We've gone through and we've made it trauma informed. So there was some things that was part of 4th R that I didn't really like. That it was, they have this rule of 5s, which in principle, I really like it, but I think it works better for kids who look like my kids. Basically, if they're upset about something, and the rule of 5s is, well, is it going to matter in 5 seconds? Yes. Is it going to matter in 5 minutes? Yes. Is it going to matter in 5 hours? Yeah, I'll still be sad about it. Is it going to matter in 5 days? No, And so those kind of stuff, that rule of 5s is really cool. But if you have it with a kid who is in a terrible, violent neighborhood or violent home, and they witness something bad, is it going to matter in 5 days and 5 years? Maybe. And so I didn't really like that sample. So we went through and changed some stuff to make it more trauma informed. We also went and looked at it from a racial equity lens to make sure that it wasn't just helping people who look like my kids. And then most importantly, what we've done is this cluster randomized trial. And what that means is that we had 24 schools in the Houston area. 12 schools got 4th R, 12 schools got just their typical health curriculum. And then we followed these kids over time. We did a baseline level of violence, substance use, sexual behavior, all that. Then we did the intervention, and then we followed them. And if you go to the next slide, what we found was that it was effective in that kids who were in, you could ignore the slide on the left, but basically what it did is kids who were in the middle schools that had 4th R were less likely to perpetrate physical dating violence over the next year than kids who received just the health curriculum. So it's effective for middle school students. There's been another study with Canadian high school students that's shown it's effective. And so this is something that we can do to prevent dating violence. And if you go to the next slide, and this is the slide that I really love. It's before I turn it over to Meredith again. It's a quote by FDR that says, if you're going to do anything for the common man, you have to start before he becomes a man. And it just makes so much sense. You know, before they developed this pattern of relating or negative patterns, and just from a strictly cost perspective, it is just absolutely stupid that we don't spend more money on prevention, because we will save so much money down the line. I mean, it's like if y'all follow Galveston at all, we have this Ike Dike project that's going to cost billions of dollars to prevent flooding in the next hurricane. Billions of dollars is a lot of money, but we're going to have another hurricane, and it's going to cost billions more if we don't have the Ike Dike. And so it sucks. It costs a lot. And the problem is prevention is not politically expedient, because prevention takes years to have an effect, right? So if you're a politician, you don't want to give all the money for prevention, because you're going to be out of office or dead by the time that it comes to fruition, right? So anyway, that's my soapbox. Thank you all for listening. I'm going to be around for questions after Meredith talks about her stuff.
Thank you, Jeff. I think it's so great that we have access to research like you're doing. It really informs the work that we do, and points us in the right direction. Like where do we need to address, and what's going to make the most impact? So thank you for sharing all of that. I am with the City of San Antonio Metropolitan Health District, our health department here in San Antonio. I work for a program called Project Worth, which we focus on child and teen health with a specific focus on social and emotional development. But we're part of the Community Health and Safety Division here at the health department. And so there's several other programs in our division. We have, as a health department, tried to find various ways to integrate violence prevention in the work that we're doing with the various populations that we work with. For instance, our population with Project Worth adolescents, young people, but we have a couple of other programs I'm going to touch on as well. And I would just add, you know, there's so much value in these evidence-based curriculums and programs because they show that they're effective. And when we're able to implement them, I think that's a beautiful thing. From the health department, we're often stepping in to complement, I think, other programs as well in school districts and support other community organizations and support. So we try to find, while our program has done evidence-based programs as well and supported them, I think both by implementing and funding, we try to also look for other ways to support the work that's already being done, or when there's limited time and resources, what can we do that will be helpful, not harmful? So I've listed a few things, just overarching kind of themes that have had some community impact here in San Antonio. Specifically around education, as I mentioned, evidence-based programs like 4th R. We've also done Project Worth historically. We've done a lot of work around reproductive health, sexual health, teen pregnancy prevention work, and worked with school districts to implement evidence-based programs that integrate healthy relationships. That has been something that we very much center and promote with the organizations that we work with in finding programs that center healthy relationships and violence prevention. We also recently used Too Good for Violence social perspectives, a social emotional learning curriculum that centers healthy relationships. Love Notes being another one that's widely used in the community, centering healthy relationships. And then complementing what's already happening on the schools. Project Worth, we've had longstanding relationships with many of the school districts here in San Antonio, and we've done a lot of work around the bullying prevention. So even having these conversations with the younger kids, elementary level, around just friendships, what's acceptable, what's not in a friendship, what's healthy, what's not. So starting young is a big key with the education. And then as we've moved on to the middle school, high school age, having those conversations, even if it's just carrying on the dialogue and presenting that information and resources to young people through education sessions around healthy relationships and violence prevention. A lot of that has been accomplished through partnership. So for Project Worth, we've partnered a lot with like YWCA, Healthy Futures of Texas, the Rape Crisis Center, another great resource. I think from the public health perspective, and how can we, or where do we begin in addressing teen dating violence with the young people we know and preventing it, is reaching out to other community organizations and form partnerships, bringing resources to the table and thinking innovatively and creatively about how we can do that. So these partnerships really have helped support the work. I would add to that, when Jeff mentioned he was talking about, and we were talking about like risks, right? With regard to mental health piece. Another way we have also supported through community partnerships is by funding mental health. We currently support mental health counseling services through University Health System at their teen clinic and communities and schools. And so we try to have a strong reach especially with young parents, both girls and boys. You know, it's not just about pregnant mama, it's about both. And that really stemmed out of work that we were doing with teen parents and them voicing the need for mental health services and access to help support healthy relationships, not even just with their intimate partner, but with their own parents. And that's where we were hearing a lot of that. So that's another way not directly, it's not just about teen dating violence, but we're addressing mental health to help support healthy relationships, right? And so if there's ways that your organization can do that as well, even if you're not doing the direct service, we don't provide counseling ourselves, but we're supporting organizations that can, right? So additionally, beyond just my program, we have in the health department, like I mentioned, a couple other programs that really do integrate violence prevention, healthy relationship building. Healthy Start is another one of our community health and safety maternal child health programs that's really focused on ensuring healthy pregnancies and births. And they do this through case management and also providing support for both mom and dad. There's a fatherhood program integrated in that. But they do healthy relationship classes and education, as well as depression screening and getting them to mental health services. So there's a very strong alignment, I think, in our health department with regards to mental health and healthy relationships through many of our programs. And then of course we have our fairly new violence prevention division, which does so much and is helping put on this wonderful symposium. But I just wanted to point to a few key things as they relate to the research that was shared. They have a triple P positive parenting program that is utilized evidence-based program. So that, of course, not specific to teen dating violence, but as we know, the exposure to family violence is a predictor. So that is very important. They also are supporting adolescent counseling services in the community, similar to what we do with Project Worth. We have a trauma-informed care, it's pretty much a systems level change that's happening in the city and getting people to adopt trauma-informed care approach, other entities, other departments in our city. And then, of course, a partnership with SAPD, right? So that's something the violence prevention has integrated, bringing in the crisis response team into the health department, taking more of that public health approach and responding to violence. And then the beauty in all of that is that we're all in the health department now. And so we're sharing these resources and knowledge and learning from one another and to have a stronger response in preventing teen dating violence. Just to zone in a little bit, Jeff mentioned positive youth development. That is a pretty much our centered kind of focus for Project Worth. We have social emotional development. We utilize the CASTLE framework, which is to the right of the screen. So not always necessarily doing a curriculum, though we are going to be implementing one that is specific to this, but also finding ways, how do we promote these 5 areas in everything we're doing all the time when we're interacting with youth? How can we help them build up these skills, right? Self-management, self-awareness, responsible decision-making, relationship skills being the big one there, and social awareness. Very much aligned, of course, with supporting mental health, but strengthening positive and protective factors for young people. We also approach this through parent messaging and education as well. So you'll see on the left side, we have like a Let's Talk card. This is a tool we use when we're out in the community and we have an opportunity to talk to a caregiving adult about what are some things that they can do to help support young people in their life. And they draw specifically from these 5 areas of social emotional development. But it includes like a little written in, I plan to help support them this way. And this is we just try to take every opportunity we can to talk about healthy relationships, positive relationships, and how we can support young people. So I share that just if you're trying to think of a way, how do I start addressing healthy relationships in the work we do? Obviously, look to the research, what's working, what's most effective, but there's other positive things we can do to strengthen that, even in small moments. And lastly, I just wanted to talk a little bit about youth involvement as well. In the health department with Project Worth, we have a program called Teen Ambassadors. I would say broadly in San Antonio, there's many youth advisory councils, youth leadership councils across organizations that have various, missions. Ours is specific around elevating youth voice to promote teen health. So annually, our teen ambassadors, they select which issues, that they want to address through community impact projects. And year after year after year, it's teen dating violence is one that comes up. So we make a special effort every February, because it's Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month, to get our teen ambassadors involved in messaging, sharing resources with their peers. So just on this slide, you'll just see a few examples. I won't play any videos, but you can check them out on our Dream SA YouTube channel of skits they've put together to share resources, to share information about demonstrate what's acceptable, what's not acceptable in a relationship for them, and also a partnership with the domestic violence division is one of those. This year, they chose to do posters to put up with resources around their schools. So for us, youth adult partnership is a big thing. It's part of positive youth development, giving them the platform and bringing them to the table of decision making. We understand that they're the experts, right, on their health, and they also, you know, when they have an issue, a lot of the times the first person they go to is their friends. So it makes sense that to us that we get them involved in the prevention side of it, right? What can they do? What are they seeing? And how can they effectively help their friends or themselves, you know, if they don't have those resources or knowledge? So just kind of to drive that point home, if, you know, if you're not engaging with youth when it comes to teen dating violence prevention or any other health, you know, youth health issue, why, you know, why not? Bring them to the table and think about ways we can engage youth. It's very powerful for them, and it's very insightful and powerful, I think, for us as practitioners to learn from them. And I think we could accomplish a lot more with them as at the helm as our partners. But I will leave with that. And Jeff, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I just look forward to any questions that anyone has or anything else. I appreciate the invite here and enjoyed presenting.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for taking the time out of your day to join our symposium and providing us with such thoughtful input today. If you all don't have any other questions, we'll go ahead and wrap up this session. I dropped a link to our next session. It won't be on Zoom. It's going to be live streamed on ksat12.com. So to all of our participants, if you want to head over there, we'll see you very soon.
Cool. Thank you, Noah. Thank you, Meredith. Thank you all.
Thank you. You all have a good day.